Hello everyone and welcome to our channel. My name is Summer and this is a video of how I made my 1844 silk gown. This journey began in early September of last year when Savannah and I decided we were going to make new outfits for the upcoming Dickens of a Christmas in Franklin, Tennessee. She had found a dress in Janet Arnold's Patterns of Fashion 1 that she wanted to try to emulate and was well on her way to constructing her gown, while I was sitting here with no ideas. So I decided to go onto Pinterest for some inspiration and fell in love with this lovely gown. I just needed to modify the design to fit the 40s since A Christmas Carol was published in 1843. I like to draw to process what I am thinking. It helps me figure out the construction process of garments and helps me decide which details to pick or eliminate. So through lots of sketching and more research, I came up with this lovely lady as my final draft. I couldn't really find any information on how to make this style of gown, so I decided to take Savannah's pattern piece that she had made and attempt to insert the cutouts myself. This ended up being really difficult because I wasn't really sure how to position the diamonds or the correct proportions. So in the end, I decided just to pick what I thought looked the best and proceed from there. I just got done with the prototype and yeah, it has a lot of problems. First off, I definitely cut the top diamond too big. It goes way too far from side to side. And I think I cut this top part on the wrong grain because it's like really stretched out. But I mean, let's try to think positive. It's not a complete disaster. I mean, the shape's pretty good. I like the neckline. I do think that this top bar right here needs, like, the angle is wrong. It needs to be a little lower to show more of this top line. But yeah, also the pleats, they were so pretty, and then I took it off the dress form, and this fabric's not meant for this type of construction. I don't know. Also, the boobs kept coming out pointy no matter how many times I redid the darts. I don't know. I just think I need to go back to the drawing board. If we could just have it all look like that. So update, I was leafing through Patterns of Fashion 1 the other day, and lo and behold, here is an actual pattern from 1844 that is very similar to the type of dress I want to do. I spent so much time looking for this online and in the other books, and I never noticed this till just now. So I went ahead and I scaled it up and got something like this, and I roughly measured out the waist. It's going to be a little bit small for me, so what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to set my current mock-up to the side, and I'm going to add a 5/8 inch seam allowance and only sew it up a 1/2 inch and see if it should come close, hopefully, to what my waist measurement needs to be. Alright guys, here is mock-up number 2, and as you can see, it fits way better than the first one. It's still a little tight in the back even though I sized it up, so I think I'm just going to add another inch on the back of the pattern, and then I'll just fit it when I go to make the actual garment. But I really like it. I changed corsets just because the shape was a little bit better, and even with padding out the corset, the bust still is a little bit big, so I'm just going to go and take that in some. Then I'm going to try to figure out how exactly I'm going to do the more off the shoulder neckline. I might have to raise this one up a little bit just because I think if I cut it over, it's going to end up being more off the shoulder than I want. So yeah, I think I'll just go take this in a little bit and maybe mess with this top neckline. I'm not sure. And I think I'm going to steal Savannah's mock-up sleeve that she made, because I'm basically going to use the same pattern, but I'm going to do a different decorative thing on the top. But yeah, way happier with this one. So I went back and reworked the pattern for the lower neckline, and while I was at it, I decided to just go ahead and change the cutouts back to a diamond shape instead of the triangular shape, just to see how it would look on me. Alright guys, I've refitted the bodice and attached Savannah's mock-up sleeve, and it's a lot better. I went ahead and I added the sleeve heading just to practice to see what it looked like, and I think I like it. Just did it to mimic the front design. This still isn't sitting great, but the side that has a sleeve on it is sitting really well, so I think having the sleeve on it will actually help correct it. This right here, it just got stretched out again because I couldn't be bothered to use a good fabric for my mock-up, so it's really wonky, but the actual outside part is sitting fairly well. I think one thing I'm going to change on the sleeve is that it's not very gathered down here, and I think I'm just going to make it fuller down here so that it can be more poofy like the 1830 sleeves. And I think I might put a point on the cuff so that it will mimic the point on the bodice. But yeah, I think just a few more adjustments and I'll be ready to actually cut some silk. Alright guys, I thought I'd show you my fabrics that I chose for this gown. I was looking for a silk taffeta, which is what this is, but I was actually originally looking for it in blue. But I found this on Etsy, and it was a really good deal because it was several yard remnants. The whole ad was for 10 yards, so I went ahead and got all of them. But when I got the package, there was a bit of deception because this one, which I don't know if I can make it change, but it's actually a much more saturated color. There it kind of goes. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to keep these 2 yards aside, and I'm going to make my bonnet out of that. And then I'm going to use this for the dress, which I'm really excited. I've never worked with silk before, but I'm also a little nervous just because I don't want to mess it up. But yeah, I'm excited. It's not a color I would normally choose for myself. I'm a little bit nervous that it'll make me look washed out, but I guess we'll just have to see. I guess my hand doesn't look too bad on it right now. But anyway, this is a polished cotton that I'm going to use for my lining, which it's from a previous project, so hopefully it will be enough. But yeah, I guess it's time to quit procrastinating and actually do this. After cutting out my silk and lining pieces, I proceeded to place them together and do some large pad stitches just to keep them from moving around during construction. I also did a large running stitch across all of the edges. Before I could start with construction, I needed to make some piping to go on the edges and in between the seams of my gown. I used a yardstick to cut silk strips on the bias and then used them to cover a small cotton cord to create my own piping trim. I made up 8 yards of piping in total, but ended up having to go back and make a couple more yards before I was done. Here I'm carefully pinning and back stitching piping to the chalk lines, clipping the seam allowance as I go to get an accurate fit. It was at this point I was really glad I had made the decision to cut the piping strips on the bias and instead of on the grain like I had originally planned, because I wanted to try to save fabric. If I had, I don't think that the piping would have had enough flexibility to round the increasingly sharp corners of these cutouts. Now it was time to open the cutouts, clipping as close to the corners as I could to get a crisp turn. Then I pushed the seams to the back and ironed it all down. Then I trimmed away all the excess seam allowance to keep the front panel from becoming too bulky. I prepared the lining piece by clipping and ironing the cutouts open. Then I blind stitched the openings together to create a completely bound front panel. Now it was time to start on the gathered front panel that would sit behind the cutouts. First, I used a piece of hem tape to add a boning channel to the bottom of the front lining. This would help prevent the point of the bodice from wrinkling while being worn. Then I used a remnant of silk to create the gathers by putting rows of running stitches every 1 3/4 inches. I did end up going back after a few lines and eyeing in rows of stitching between them. I figured with more gathering threads, the gathers would be more uniform and less likely to move around. This whole process took me approximately 10 hours over a weekend, and it was surprisingly one of the more time-consuming parts of this gown. I then stitched the gathered fabric to the lining panel, meticulously knotting every gathering thread securely in place before trimming all the excess fabric away. Before the bodice could be put together, each seam was prepared by basting a piece of piping into place. The front panel was so thick that I ended up having to stab stitch the first 2 seams together, but after that, backstitching was easy and the bodice came together rather quickly. I don't know if you want your face in it.
I don't know.
Want me to do another walk in? It's like, D, you're a girl. You know what I mean, right? So proud. I can't help it. It's cute. After the fitting, it was time to whip down the raw edges of the seams to the lining, being careful not to catch the silk below. This not only helps it from fraying, but also creates a casing to put boning in later. Once all the seams are whipped down, I carefully stitch the end to each boning casing to the correct length, being careful once again not to catch the silk on my way out. I use zip ties to bone the bodice, using a designated pair of scissors to cut each piece to size and clipping the ends carefully until rounded and smooth. I find that zip ties are less expensive and more readily available than the boning typically found in fabric stores, and they do the job just fine. Then it was time to prepare the back closure. I had Savannah help me mark the position during the fitting and used that line to stitch the piping into place. Once that was done, I trimmed off the excess and folded the seam allowance over to create boning channels and stitched them into place. I inserted boning into the back channels and then stitched piping to the bottom of the bodice. This secures all the boning into place and finishes the bottom edge to attach the skirt to later. I made thread eyes by stitching a series of small loops and then going over them with a buttonhole stitch to consolidate and strengthen them. I did this in an effort to help camouflage the closure. I didn't want little gleams of silver metal peeking out between the seams and ruining the illusion. I tend to have a hard time lining up hooks and eyes on markings alone, so I usually sew one side on firmly, link them together, and while using my thumb to hold it into place, quickly tacking on the other side. I can then secure it without fear of shifting it out of position. I proceeded to construct the sleeve headings in the same manner as the front panel of the bodice, with the exception of bagging out the lining so that all raw seams would be encased inside. I figured this would be better than whipping down seams since the sleeves are subject to greater wear and tear. This process was much easier to document than the front cutout panel, so enjoy the step-by-step time lapse. To create more volume in the sleeve, I took Savannah's pattern piece and copied 10 extra inches along the fold. When I gathered the front of the bodice, I didn't like how I could easily see the thread from between the gathers, so this time I did much smaller running stitches so that when viewed from the right side, the threads would be nearly invisible. It was something I hadn't really thought about, since most of the time I am putting gathers into a seam and the gathering thread usually gets pulled out afterward. I clipped the seam allowance and felled open the last 4 inches of the sleeves to allow ease for my hand to pass through once the cuff was attached. To finish the inside seam of the sleeve, I did a sort of inverted French seam by clipping and folding the seam allowance toward each other and whip stitching it close. I gathered in the bottom of the sleeve and stitched it to the cuff. After that, I pushed the seam allowance to the inside and whip stitched the lining down to encase the raw edges. Then I added hooks and eyes to the cuffs and the sleeves were done. My sleeves ended up being a bit too big for the arm's eye, so I had to clip the seam allowance a little more severely to get it to fit. My mock-up sleeve did just fine, so I chalk it up to the silk having less give. Once again, the layers were super thick, so I had to stab stitch the sleeves into place. To make the skirt, I took my waist to floor measurement and added 2 inches of fold over for cartridge pleats. I used this measurement to cut 3 panels the width of my fabric, clipping and drawing thread to make straight cutting lines. Then I stitched the panels together, leaving the center back seam open at the top to attach a placket. I had to calculate how much more to fold over the skirt for the cartridge pleats to compensate for the point on the front of the bodice. I used elastic to mark the waistline and where the point of the bodice rests, and used that to measure the difference. There was a 3-inch difference between the point and the natural waistline of the bodice, so in order to make a fold line with the correct slope, I laid out the skirt, marked 2 inches on each of the sides, 5 inches down the center front, and drew a line connecting the points. I repeated this process on the opposite side of the skirt, but only marking a line 2 inches down across the entire back. To make the cartridge pleats, I folded the skirt along the line and ran a running stitch near the edge with a heavy thread. The skirt can then be drawn up into hundreds of tiny pleats. They always remind me a little bit of ribbon candy when they're done. After that, putting on the skirt was pretty easy. I had the sides, center front, and center back of the skirt already marked, so I just pinned them to their respective seams and points and distributed the pleats evenly in between. I attached the skirt by stitching the top of every pleat to the bottom of the bodice, just above the piping stitching. After they were all stitched on, I removed the gathering thread and added the skirt placket. I didn't have much time left to decorate my gown, so I decided to keep it simple and adorn it with some cultured pearls I had left over from a 20s project. Finally, she was complete. Huh? I have another camera with me though. Like, how am I gonna hide that?
Make him wait for it, Travis. Boom.